Within this project, I examine the colonial histories embedded in plant names and their journeys. Conscious of reducing my own carbon footprint and being ecologically responsible, my own urban garden in Manchester is a reference point. Sustainability is at the centre of this project, recognising that some of today's inequalities are linked to our colonial past. Horticulturist Claire Ratinon states, very rarely are questions asked about the origins of a plant as to where it was taken from and what it symbolised. This documentary takes up that challenge. My creative process begins with research, drawing on a variety of archival materials and academic sources, grounding my work within a historical context and to inform ethical and responsible storytelling. Through my own taxonomy of garden plants, I became aware of the colonial roots I've inherited. Through photography, I confront the legacy of appropriation. The introduction of non-native plants to cities such as Manchester was shaped by colonial expansion, global trade routes and activities of traders. Specimens were acquired, not discovered, from around the world, sometimes by force or by exploitation, with little regard for the people or ecosystems from which they were taken. Many familiar garden plants, from red poppies and magnolia to wisteria and agapanthus, are exotics, imported during the colonial era. Botanists were often the agents of empire. Nurseries played a pivotal role, turning exotic specimens into mere commodities. Demand was insatiable, and 19th century nursery owners and private sponsors employed plant hunters to travel to the colonies and collect plants which they could sell, which, as Alcorn states, transformed our gardens forever and extended their roots beyond recognition. Those buying the plants perhaps oblivious or not caring or complicit as to how they got here, plants just meant status and respectability. Profits of slavery and colonial exploitation fueled this botanical transformation, financing the grand houses and lavish gardens of Britain. Gardens became symbols of privilege, beautiful yet marked by the injustices that enabled their creation. La Corbinaire states that colonial botanists and plant hunters such as Banks and Wickham were involved in projects that involved violent exploitation against lands and people and displacement of people and plants through slavery. Some of the flora in my garden was sourced from National Trust properties such as Dunham Massey, which I discovered was home to the families of the Booths and Greys who profited from South Africa's colonisation and had associations with the East India Company. The National Trust started to recognise and address their colonial connections and the trade in enslaved people that lay behind the design of buildings and gardens and parklands and the plants and collections that filled them. Researching contemporary journals, diaries and newspaper archives, the story behind orchids brought home the impact of ecological colonial exploitation. Plant hunters recount losses of fragile orchids destroyed, trampled underfoot and discarded. Cecil, in 1910, wrote, "Most of the orchid-growing portions of the globe have been ransacked and packed off by the thousands to this country, leaving native habitats bare." Auger called it wanton robbery. It left ecological scars, nature ravaged by greed. It was more than just greed. Gray and Shake argue colonial botany involved the erasure of indigenous knowledge, plants and ecological practices. Plants were namely named after white Western men. Acknowledgement of female and indigenous plant collectors are largely absent regarding plant names and from botanical database records. Botanists such as Linnaeus and Sloane influenced the development of scientific racism. As Wells wrote regarding land acquisition, naming functions as a claim on territory. The same can be said with plants. There is now, albeit gradual, a move to recognise the inherent racism and for its removal within botanical records. Ashman responds to the colonial view that Jamaica was a land of milk and honey, ripe for economic exploitation, and states it was no paradise for enslaved and indentured people. Lindsay's botanical drawings relied on the knowledge of the enslaved Africans to develop his understanding of plants and their collection. There is no recognition of these people, and Ashton says, "I want to find the stories of my ancestral people who are missing in the archive." Orlo criticises the alleged discovery and subsequent naming and cataloguing of plants which he says disregarded and obliterated existing indigenous plant names and botanical knowledge, and imposed the Linnaean system of classification and its particular European rationality. Although recovers the lost indigenous languages of his homeland, Guatemala, the project revisits a book of medicinal plants labelled in conquering Spanish and attempts to imagine a different history, with Mayan spiritual guides writing the plant names in their languages onto its pages. De Souza relates stories of plants to her own cultural removal. Blue Haze is a story of the eucalypt taken from Aboriginal land by the British and relocated across the world. It was taken for economic gain as the fastest tall in growing hardwood. Thirsty and flammable, the tree subsequently lowered water tables and increased fire risk in areas that these plantations have been transported to. When I observe the eucalyptus in my own garden, I am reminded of this story, and that the entanglement of plants and peoples are inextricably tied to understanding place and a notion of belonging. Preston examines a narrative around the invasive non-native rhododendron from the perspective of cultural exchange, displacement and resilience. Once highly prized, it is now unwanted, an unwelcome alien, and she draws parallels to her own experience and the growing alienation towards human migrants within the UK. She challenges us to reconsider notions of belonging, identity, and the complexities of coexistence. Preston stated, which moved me greatly, I started by cutting the world open. I ended by cutting myself open. It reflects her questioning the authority of Western science and recognising, for the first time maybe, her own position in the patriarchal societies of both China and Britain, and her realisation that nature is both cultured and gendered. With regard to Sontag's ethics of seeing, I pair my photographs with the original indigenous names and their stories, perspectives often marginalised or erased through colonialism. I invite viewers to look beyond the surface of these plants and to engage critically with their complex histories to encourage reflection on justice and future sustainability. The melancholic aesthetic used is to counter the usual saturated or beautified photographic portrayals of colonial plants, a subdued approach to reflect the fragility, loss and ever-increasing erasure of our ecosystems. In relation to Barth's rhetoric of the image, I've used text as anchorage and relay. However, I've struggled with the visual design of image and text. Using Dwayne Michael's style of handwriting alongside images did not work, contextually inappropriate and visually unbalanced. I experimented with various styles, but I need to acquire design skills for the future. Ultimately, taking on peer advice, I went for a streamlined and consistent style. For a sustainable future, we need to move away from the white Eurocentric gaze and embrace diverse knowledge systems and stewardship to restore ecosystems. Plant names are vessels for memory and identity. Reclaiming original names is more than just a gesture. It's the start of me challenging the colonial narrative that linger in my garden, and to acknowledge celebrating the diversity of ways people relate to and understand the natural world. There is so much more to tell, and I look forward to delving into the colonial records of local national trust properties for the final major project.